Okay, so we're looking today at war in the Iliad, which hasn't come up yet as a 20 or a 30 marker. I put two sort of questions that might come up there. Is war presented as glorious? Is war presented realistically in the Iliad? And then from the specification, we've got the portrayal of war and death and mortality. I'm trying to crank out as many videos as possible in the run up to your exams. I know you've only got about a week. But please, 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 just a reminder to you, I shared the link, the Mossbon lot. I shared the link with you to my area with all of my essay plans and with all of my notes. Make sure you're looking at the specification. The specification has all the themes that you could be asked a question on. So you need to make sure in the next week you have an essay plan for every single thing that is on the specification. If you look at my area, there will be a PowerPoint on pretty much every single area that comes up in the specification as well. So make sure you're using those while you're planning your revision. If you're not doing that, you're a fool. If you're sat there just rereading the Iliad, you're a fool. You need to be making sure that you're creating essay plans to save you time in that exam, because time is so, so valuable. So as we approach war is obviously throughout the entire poem, and it's a bit of a broad topic. So I'm just going to use scholarship to base ourselves around, and I'm just going to pick out a couple of scholars, but there are more that you should be using in a scholarship essay. Remember, it's about quantity and quality of scholarship and the way you engage with them. So first up, we've got Ryu. This is from your introduction to the 1950s version. So he says that the Iliad was not written to glorify war, but to emphasize its tragic futility. And we're going to focus on those tragic futility words there. So a few examples where we see the sort of tragic futility of war in the Iliad. We see it, first of all, through Achilles in book 1, where he questions Agamemnon as to why they're fighting for him. He says that nobody came and stole my wife, so why am I here for you? And he really thinks about this whole issue. Obviously, he then creates war in some respects between him and Agamemnon, which causes him so much grief and ends up with him asking for Thetis to make sure that the Greeks lose and that the Trojans take lots of Greek lives, obviously not realising that within those Greek lives is going to be Patroclus. And we see Achilles at the end in book 24. Number one, obviously, he chooses to respect Priam. He chooses respect of Priam and the gods and sort of acceptance of his mortality over murder and over killing the king of Troy. And where we leave Achilles in the Iliad, he's cuddling Briseis. He's curled up fast asleep. He's finally sleeping after many books of not sleeping. And we get this question, really, was it all worth it? So in between in book 1, him losing Briseis, and book 24, him being reconciled with her, has it all been worth it? Because he's lost everything else and he's sealed his fate in terms of death as well. So in that sense, was the war worth it, or was it tragically futile? Obviously, if you get a war question, you should be looking at book 4. Make sure if you haven't reread book 4. In terms of a war essay, think book 4, war. It's very easy. We get this onslaught of battle. We get this list of endless names. They don't have a side, so we're not really sure who wins, who loses. And we get that very last line of book 4. They lay there, the Greeks and the Trojans, they lay there in their multitudes, face down in the dust. We don't know who's won and who's lost, but what we do know is that there have been lots of dead people and there has been lots of death. We also get at the start of book 4 when we get this council of the gods, where they are debating which cities to save and which cities to not. The gods insinuate there'll be more cities that fall, so they sort of trade the cities and say, look, you can take this city, you can take Carthage, you can take Troy, you can take Mycenae, wherever. We know that war will continue. This Trojan War is not the end of the war. And in terms of the endings, I would consider, does Homer give us a satisfying conclusion to this war? No, he doesn't. We finish in book 24 still with plenty of the war to go, still with much more death to come. We know that Achilles is going to be one of those dead people. We know Priam is going to be one of those dead people. And so he doesn't end this war with it having achieved anything. We know how it's going to end, and it's going to end in much more death. So, Ryu, tragic futility. Keep that as a key scholar for if you had a war essay. Your next one would be Martin Hammond. He says that war is not the main subject of the Iliad, nor heroism, but human suffering and death. And this quote goes on to say that the women grieve and mourn, the children will die, the old men will suffer and die as well. So have a look at the scholarship's PowerPoint that I've given you. Martin Hammond, war not being the subject of the Iliad, but human suffering and death. And this obviously could come up as a heroism essay as well, that you could use this scholar. So if we think of disregarding war and disregarding heroism, we want to think about those other people that suffer. So first things first, if you had a war essay, I would definitely mention women. The women, as Edith Hall says, have a role to grieve. And as Natalie Haynes says, Andromache embodies the suffering. We see that women have already suffered in the face of war in Chryseis and Briseis in Book 1, and we know that a similar fate awaits the women in Troy. Remember, Andromache and Briseis came from the same town. They came from Eetion's town, and we have them here on two separate sides, but both will face the same fate in the end of being slaves. Andromache in particular embodies the suffering of war, because as she tells us in Book 6, Achilles has already murdered her entire family. In terms of speeches, the women very rarely speak, but when they do get the opportunity, it's often to express their grief and their suffering. So we want to think of Briseis in Book 19 when she mourns Patroclus. We get big speeches from Andromache, Helen, and Hecuba in Books 22 and 24. Indeed, while I've said it's tempting to focus on heroes for a war essay and to think about just the battling, we'd definitely do at least a paragraph on those people left behind. So we've talked about the women, but also include the old men and the children. We hear that Achilles has a son that will be left fatherless in Book 19, where he speaks to Patroclus. In Book 22, we hear of Andromache. She speaks of her son's future fate, that he's left orphaned and begging for food, although really we know that he's not going to survive the fall of Troy. We get Priam. He gives a heartfelt speech in Book 22, in which he makes a prediction for himself that his corpse be left to be eaten by his own dogs. So we get a really bleak picture for those that have been left behind, and those that will really suffer the war. The men will die, the women suffer everything else, essentially, as Edith Hall says. And then finally, Homer decides to end the poem on a really quiet note, such were the funeral rites of horse-taming Hector. So he doesn't focus on the war in the end of the poem. He doesn't allow his heroes to go out in a blaze of glory or talking about their sort of fighting achievements. But he focuses on a quiet moment, the sorrow of death, everybody mourning him. And also we get that this epithet for Hector, horse taming Hector. Taming horses is something that requires patience, something that requires a gentle character, and something that's done in peacetime is when you want to tame your horses. So we get this idea that Hector was actually an empathetic, sweet man, and we get all of his family around him, the city, all mourning him at the very end of the poem. And that's how Homer decides to end that poem. But all the while we know what's going to be in store for the rest of these characters. So those two scholars there that sort of focus on the negative side of war. But obviously if you've got an essay about how war is glorious, you also want to be thinking about how it is portrayed in a positive light. So how is war portrayed gloriously? Number one, it gives men this sort of sense of purpose. We get this idea that men are supposed to fight. That is what they've been trained to do their entire life. We get that it makes them sort of become confident and happy. We see it with Patroclus with his hubris in Book 16, where he pushes on even though he's done what he's been told to do. He gets carried away. He starts mocking people. He starts jeering people. He becomes this sort of central character and changes how he behaves. And we see that similarly with Hector and his hubris in Book 18, where we've got this where Polydamas suggests that they retreat. Is that in Book 18? Yes. Polydamas suggests that they retreat, and Hector says, but we were just there. We were just at the Greek camp walls. Why would we retreat right now? And we also get this sense that this was what they've been raised to do for their entire life. So we get it through Hector in Book 6, where he says, I've been trained to do this. I do this for the glory of my father. If I didn't, I'd feel shame, that eidos before the Trojans and Trojan women in the trailing gowns. And we also see it through the character of Glaucus, who through telling the story of Bellerophon, he says, this is how I was raised, to respect my elders, to do better than my elders, and to make them proud. And so there's this idea that this is how you do that. And if you think of how Glaucus talks about Bellerophon, he talks about his good character, but also his feats in battle and how strong he was and what a hero he was. And indeed, you could bring in the fact that Nestor talks about all of those older characters, those older heroes from times gone past that he used to work with, like the Centaurs and the Lapiths, and how they were better men than the men they are now. War is also, you could argue, and I would say put this in your essay if you've got time. It's an in-depth point, and don't do it at the expense of other things. But we get 40 similes comparing these men to lions. On the one hand, you could say that war sort of denigrates these men to being animals and we're better than that and we should be rational as humans. But you could also say that they are at their most animalistic in the sense of they're defending themselves, they're hungry for it, it's natural. And so you could argue that all of these similes comparing the men to lions actually just show that we are all just animals and we're all supposed to be fighting. And I would always make you come back to the shield as well, because we see on the shield several images of several towns. One of them is sort of settling it through diplomacy. They have an issue that they're sitting down and talking to the council about. But we see several towns as well that are going through an ambush or going through a fight or a war. And we see the microcosm of the world on this shield. And so again, it is showing that this isn't something that is unnatural or a one-off or special or extraordinary, but war is simply a part of life. And then I would think of how war is portrayed gloriously in terms of what the men think of it and their reputation. So if you think about the people that they don't respect, so Paris in book 3 and book 6, we get Hector. He has a right go at him. He says he's an embarrassment. He says he's a sex-crazed seducer. He says in book 6 that he wishes the Trojans, if they weren't so soft-hearted, they would have stoned him to death by now. And we see in book 3 when he disappears, the Trojans are happy to give him up. They're helping the Greeks look for Paris. The Greeks are happy. Yes, sorry. The Trojans are happy for the Greeks to find Paris and to try and kill him. They're helping them look for him. He says that none of them would have hidden him had they known where he was. And if you think of our favourite character, poor little Dolon in book 10, and think about how Dolon and Odysseus and Diomedes are compared. So Dolon, he's mocked, he's made he's scared, he's afraid, he's crying, his teeth are chattering, and he gives up his people. He's a coward, is how he's presented. And he's made a mockery of, essentially. Whereas Odysseus and Diomedes, when they come back with all of their garrison, with all their information, they're praised, everyone celebrates them, and there's a whole sense of rejoicing among the Greek camp. And so war is portrayed as something that you could win your glory through, and you can certainly build your reputation through. So it's not entirely presented as a negative thing. And this is what I would base your entire essay on. It would be this quote here. So Homer presents the complexity of war, not a one-dimensional and lazy critique of it. He doesn't just, his poem isn't just to say war is bad, war is bad, war is bad, or war is good, war is good, war is good. He's portraying the complexity of it. He's portraying what it is to be human. He is dealing with the fact that conflict and death and respect and that desire to live on eternally and to win your kleos is just simply part of the human condition. And war is simply one instrument through which, one vehicle through which we could earn that respect and we could live on in terms of our lives. So this is what I would put as my introductory scholar. It's what I would keep referring back to. And I would come up with a sort of more nuanced, remember that idea of argument C. So if it is, is war glorious or not type question, go with argument C. It's not either. It's or it's both, or it's everything, all at the same time. And that's what I would base my entire essay on if I got a war essay. Questions, comments, put them in the comments. I'll get back to you and reply to you. I'll keep trying to crank out some videos in the next week. Good luck if I don't manage to see you beforehand.